World Chess Championship game number 11 recap. We have Jan with the white pieces, Magnus with the black pieces. They have 14 games for the total match, but Jan is currently down 3 points and needs a win either today or in tomorrow's game to keep the match alive. Jan sticks with 1e4, and we see the players play again, e5, knight f3, knight c6, similar to the last few games with these colors. And now Jan plays bishop to c4. So instead of going for the Roy Lopez with bishop to b5, this time he plays bishop to c4, looking for some fresh ideas. We see knight f6 attacking the e-pawn, d3, bishop c5, c3, d6, castle. This is all pretty standard Joko piano system. Now here Magnus plays a slightly rare move, pawn to a5. The idea here is it gives that bishop a chance to drop back, and it also slows down this b4 move by white. Rook e1 was played, that's standard, bishop to a7. And now again, just like every game in this match, Magnus takes us into new territory with bishop to a7. This essentially hasn't been played by any grandmasters. Twice in 2021, both online games, Magnus castled in this position. So this shouldn't be completely surprising to Jan that Magnus played this line, because we've seen Magnus already play something very similar twice just in the past year. Knight to a3 by Jan. The plan here is to play knight to c2, bishop to e3, and offer a trade of the e3 bishop for the bishop on a7. And sometimes you'll see in these positions the knight will head to d2 instead, heading to f1 with the same idea, bishop to e3, and they'll most likely transpose. Now Magnus plays h6, and the idea of h6 is to prevent a bishop to g5 idea, and also after Magnus gets castled, sometimes you want that extra space for your king so there's no back rank checkmate. So h6 is really a useful move in many cases here. And the plan for white eventually is to play this pawn up to d4. That's kind of the idea in this position. That's how white plays for a slight advantage. And here we see the first deep think by Jan, and he plays knight to c2 after a 17-minute think. And then castle by Magnus, and here's bishop to e3. Finally getting that bishop trade. There is no g5 square for Jan's bishop, so this makes a lot of sense. Now here Magnus takes his first deep think. He spends 14 minutes playing bishop takes e3, and the engine said maybe he could have avoided that trade, and even gave an idea of bishop to b8, but I think the moves are all very similar, and Jan will have a very slight advantage no matter what Magnus plays there. Knight takes e3, and now let's look at the imbalances. The e3 knight is a little bit stronger than the c6 knight, and the c3 pawn is a little bit stronger than the c7 pawn. So slight edge here for Magnus based on those imbalances. Rook to e8, and now we see a4. The idea with a4 is white wants to play queen to b3, double attacking this weakness on f7, and that also highlights one of the benefits of playing h6. There's no knight to g5 also attacking that pawn. And if queen to b3 was played prior to a4, black can play a4 here. There's no bishop takes f7 check, because after the king moves, it's difficult for the queen to keep that bishop defended, like let's say queen c4, knight a5 hitting the queen, and then wins the bishop. So queen b3 doesn't work immediately. That's why Jan played a4 in this position. And here we see bishop to e6 by Magnus, shutting down that plan on the diagonal. Bishop takes, rook takes, queen b3, threatening the b7 pawn, also preparing to play d4 soon, probably after this rook comes into the center. Still a very slight edge for Jan. And now we see b6 by Magnus, creating this V-shaped pawn structure. It's very solid. All the pawns on the dark squares. c7 is the weakest pawn, but it's very difficult for white to get to. Jan plays rook a to d1, and one of the ideas here is to play knight d5, which puts a little bit of pressure on the base of that pawn structure. Magnus prepares for that with knight e7, defending the d5 square. Now we see h3 by Jan, solid move. We are very close to equal, and Magnus still has to watch out for this d4 move by Jan. Plays queen to d7, preparing to bring the rook in. Now we see kind of a cool idea by Jan, knight to h2. What he wants to do is trade off this h2 knight for the knight on f6, and leave the remaining knight, the one on e3, because that knight has two really nice squares d5 and f5 that it could head to. So now we see rook to d8, knight g4, knight takes, and he takes with the pawn. So he's not afraid of these doubled pawns because it still leaves him with the good knight against bad knight situation. This knight is passive and defending. This knight is active and threatening to come to those outposts. But now a timely move by Magnus, pawn to d5, neutralizing that advantage with the knights. And now Jan is almost forced to play d4. And I think at this point, when Magnus played move 19 d5, he had the next three moves planned out, and there's a surprise coming up for Jan. So in this position, Magnus plays e takes d4. And I'm wondering if Jan expected d takes e, because after d takes back, queen e8, knight to c4, I think Jan does have a little bit of pull again in this position and can claim a slight advantage. But in the game line, e takes d4, I'll show you the move that I believe Jan missed coming up. E takes d5, Magnus plays rook to e4, and after queen to c2, this position is very good for Jan, except for one move, and that's what Magnus played, rook to f4. It's the only move in this position, and it looked like on the broadcast that Jan missed this move, because all of a sudden he seemed very distraught. And at this point, we have an hour and 18 minutes for Jan, 48 minutes for Magnus. And Magnus does still have to find some tough moves. If Magnus doesn't have rook f4 here, if he has to play, let's say, rook e5, then there's rook takes d4. Jan is up a pawn, because knight takes d5 will lose to pawn to c4, hitting the knight to the queen. And if he tries something like knight takes e3, for example, take queen, but then both rooks are falling. And that's completely winning for Jan. So rook f4, great move by Magnus. And this, I think, threw off Jan psychologically, because the next move Jan plays, pawn to g3, the engine's lit up and the chat went wild and the commentary team went wild, because this is a blunder by Jan. Complete blunder. He needed to play rook takes d4, it's the only move. But after rook takes d4, c takes d, knight takes d5, we see this isolated pawn on d4, pawn weaknesses on a4 and g4, and after knight takes, queen takes, even though this is close to equal, it's Magnus that's playing for a win. And Jan can't afford to have another loss, and I think because of that, he got a little bit psyched out, and he played g3, which is a blunder, and now this is completely winning for Magnus. D takes e3 was played, g takes f4. So Jan is up the exchange, but the problem is this king cannot survive the attack. Either Jan will get checkmated, or will have to give up significant amount of material. Queen takes g4 check. We see king to f1, queen h3, king to g1. Now Magnus does have the option of repeating here. Jan has kind of shown that he's maybe okay with a draw. And Jan is up 20 minutes on the clock, hour and 5 to 45 minutes. And here what Magnus needs to do is find the most accurate way to win this game. And sometimes it's easy for us as commentators or viewers to look at the engine and just say, oh, it's minus 10 points here, black is completely winning. But that's because Stockfish can calculate all the lines, 30 moves deep, figure out the win. Knight f5 was played in the game. This is the chance that Magnus had to finish the game very quickly, and Fabiano mentioned this on the stream. E takes f2 check. It's a very simple win. After queen takes f2, rook to d6, there's no good way to stop rook to g6. This is just over. This is going to win queen for rook. The game will be over after that. If king takes f2 instead of queen takes f2, now there's queen h2 check, and this picks up the queen on c2. Easy win. So e takes f2 check. I think the game would have been over in probably the next 3 moves. But Magnus plays knight f5, and this rook lift is still in the air. But now Jan plays d6, and he's able to prolong this game quite a bit longer after d6. And we see knight to h4 by Magnus, threatening 2 different checkmates. F takes e is played, and now the problem for Magnus is there's no quick checkmate. So really the best he can do is get the exchange back and play for a winning rook and pawn endgame. So this is what happens. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Queen g3, king f1, knight f3, and this threatens queen to g1 check, followed by queen to g2. So Jan forces a queen trade. And we get into this rook and pawn endgame. Magnus is only up one pawn, but he does have the more active rook, and this should still be completely winning. And we have to see what Magnus's endgame technique looks like here. King f3, rook d2, rook b1. Jan is playing active with the rook. The plan is to play b4 and activate his rook this way. So what Jan wants to do in a rook and pawn endgame where he's a little bit worse is create a scenario where it's pawn for pawn back and forth and try to make it messy, try to create a passed pawn. And he does his best here to do that. g6 by Magnus, preparing to bring the king up. Pawn to b4. And now we see a takes b4, rook takes b4. Jan is trying to create a little bit of play here. If it were white's move again, rook to c4 is a very nice move, pressuring this pawn on c7. And it would be close to equal. So Jan's only one move away from being close to equal. Rook a2 by Magnus, king e4, and now we see the plan for Jan, bring the king up and go after the c-pawn. But Magnus gets his pass pawn going up the board. King d5. Jan is trying to make things interesting. Rook to c2, a nice move by Magnus. Counterattack on this pawn. Rook b3, h4. When in doubt, always keep pushing the passed pawn. It's very strong, and it gets exponentially stronger each move it gets closer to queening. It's coming down to the h1 square. King takes, pawn h2, rook to b1. And here, if king takes b6 is played, it can be met by rook to b2 check, which is actually what we see in the game. So rook takes c3, king takes b6, and there's this fork. Rook and king, which is going to deflect the rook away from the queening square. But Jan does still have this passed pawn, so he's going to try to create a scenario where Magnus can't win the rook back, and he can try to keep pushing that a pawn up the board. Maybe get some drawing chances here, but it's going to be really difficult. Pawn to a5. Magnus centralizes the queen with queen to e4. This also threatens queen to e6, which is a nice little fork. Jan moves the king away, and now we see queen to e7 check, king to a8. And Magnus would like to check on the 8th rank here. Queen to d8 check, winning this pawn, but there is rook to b8, pinning the queen to the king. So Magnus moves the king up, and here the white pawns are going to drop soon. Jan cannot defend both a5 and e3. He played rook to b6. We see queen to c5 by Magnus, forking the pawns, putting the attack on the rook as well, and at this point, Jan resigns. So that's the end of the match. Magnus won by 4 points, so they won't play any more games. And really, this was kind of the tale of two matches. The first 5 games, Jan played really well, and I think you could even argue that Jan was outplaying Magnus a little bit in those first 5 draws. Game 6, Magnus got the win, and that was a turning point from the match. It seemed like things just very quickly went downhill for Jan after that. I don't know if he was tired, or if it was the psychology of it, or what happened, but I think, in the first 5 games, people were wondering, will there be a draw every single game? And it looked like there was some pressure on Magnus to get a win. And then Magnus turned on that typical old school Magnus grind, won that very long game, the longest game in World Chess Championship history. And after that, Jan completely fell apart. So very nice match by Magnus. Jan showed some good skill in the first 5 games, showed he deserved to be there. But then something happened and he just cracked, and he wasn't able to play a very good game after that. Magnus definitely had Jan in pressure almost every single game, and Jan lost 4 games after game 5. So hope you guys have enjoyed the recaps. I'll have a link up above. You can watch all of our previous recaps, and then make sure to subscribe to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button. We have a lot of chess improvement content, and check the links in the description below if you want to join ChessGoals. We have study plans for purchase, a Discord server, we have opening courses, and all of those things come with support in our Discord server. I'm in there, and a bunch of chess learners and chess improvers are in there as well, always talking about chess and just loving the game. So thanks for watching. Leave a note in the comments if you have any questions on this game, and hopefully we'll see you in future videos. Have a good day.